Well, hello and welcome to the Motion Racing Podcast. We are post-Miami and Miami equals apparently a black car with a white stripe and a little bit of jag on top. Yes, Mitch Evans was the winner of the Miami E-Prix, the home, of course, of Mr. Worldwide, but we could say, I think, that Formula E's own Mr. Worldwide clinched it last weekend. This time Formula E had a Formula 1 track to play with, but it was chopped down, and we'll discuss that because we've got different views on it. Gen 3 cars are quick. They showed in Mexico they don't embarrass themselves on a full-length or almost full-length F1 circuit. We didn't quite get that, but we did get a spectacular sub 1 minute lap that maybe didn't conclusively tell us if Formula E can put together a similar on-track spectacle to F1, but comparing the two series may well be a fool's errand at this point, especially this far into Formula E. So I think the message from me would be, let Formula E off the leash and the Gen 3 cars create an uninhibited spectacle. And yet, next to the freeway, great racing can still elevate its surroundings, and that coldly executed switchback move from Evans did just that. The Jaguar driver, who's been in Formula E since 2016, and unlike most of the field, as we'll discuss later, has consistently stuck to the series rather than branching out into, for example, sports cars, has become one of the veterans of this young form of motorsport. Even if, amazingly, he's still only 31. Do we sometimes forget about his unique set of skills? So ensconced in Formula E is he? Well, I know at least one person who never forgets, maybe two, but maybe some of us, like me, are guilty of it sometimes. After a pointless 25-26 season up to this race, Vince is on the board now, and with Formula E title challenges often starting slow, there's no reason why he can't be a contender for the biggest prize. I'm Sascha, and for the third time running, I'm so happy to see Georgie Mackay. So, Georgie, I think you agree that the Evans performance was masterful, but maybe you've got a bit of a contention with my complaints about the Miami track there.
Yeah, I was going to say I don't completely agree with you on the track layout at Miami. I think it's fantastic, and I think it's interesting that we're critiquing the layout that we probably also agree that has had the best racing so far this season. It showed that the layout is ultimately what allowed for the racing. The cars can only drive the track that they're given, and I think to that extent it is a bit of a fool's game when it comes to comparing Formula 1 and Formula E, mainly because of the design philosophy that goes to the tracks. When you look at Miami's Grand Prix track, it's got maybe 4 or 3.5 realistically long power sections where you're just wide open throttle the whole time, and that realistically minimizes the relative percentage of regeneration that the cars would be able to use over the course of the laps. When we see tracks like the Miami layout being used, or this specific Miami layout being used, what I would say is that's actually really good design from the, I think it was Apex Racing Circuits that designed the Miami Grand Prix layout. Because they've made a multi-use space. It's going to be useful for more motorsports than just Formula 1. Whereas we look at tracks like sort of Spa now, and I'm a historical critic of Spa. It was joked about if I ran for a Formula 1 FIA president that my ticket would be to take Spa off the calendar and nothing else. Well, make the cars lighter as well, of course. But I don't think Formula E cars would do very well at Spa. But on the flip side, Monte Carlo is, in my opinion, the best E-Prix. So I think it really does come down to the design philosophy of the tracks. Maybe it's Herman Tilke's tracks that aren't quite so suited to Formula E cars because they're just not designed with regeneration in mind. They're designed with high power, flat out sections in mind and a lot of aero. But that's another thing the Formula E cars don't really have. They don't really have that much aero to carry through high-speed sections. Certainly the Hankook tires aren't good enough to carry the speed through those high-speed sections anyway. But realistically, I think this alternate layout of the Miami Grand Prix had generated really good racing. And that's because it was a good circuit that was tailored to the cars. And I think that's what we need more of in motorsport more generally, is circuits that are tailored towards the categories that are racing on them. But if the goal is to have Formula E running at the Monza main layout, I think we're probably still a far way away from that.
Yeah, I really don't think that's the goal of Formula E, but maybe we can idealize a bit and say, is the goal of Formula E to move to, what Andrew Frankel might call proper circuits, or is it to have this kind of hybrid mix? Because we are still going to streets, and I'm very glad when we do, because that's part of the fabric of the sport from the start. actually it doesn't ruin the spectacle when they're on big wide circuits anymore. I feel like they don't look unsuited anymore, thanks to, the sheer progression in how Gen 3's gone.
I think something that's probably being slept on in Formula E is how well it can be run in arenas, specifically places like we had Homestead, Miami last year, which is an oval with an arena around it. Infield layouts like that are perfect for Formula E. I think of the example of the Las Vegas infield road course B, where it's basically like 8 corners and it's a very, very tight circuit. That's the kind of track that they would have raced on in season 1. And I think when you look at the evolution from tracks like that to tracks like the Homestead Miami track that they have, I think why not run more races in these arenas? If the FIA is truly serious about expanding into the US, as it seems to be with Formula One, why can't Formula E be held at an alternative layout of Indianapolis? Or if we're going to dream, let's dream Daytona. Let's have the Daytona road course with Formula E on it. Maybe we can try and cut the oval out in some way, because that would be a long, very high power section. There definitely wouldn't be any regen there. But it'd be really interesting to see 3 Formula E cars go into the bus stop.
Absolutely. And now that we've talked about the track layout at Miami, we maybe ought to talk about the man that, really lit it up and made it into a spectacle this weekend. You've already said that you don't sleep on Mitch at all. You've always known what a yardstick he is for the rest of the field. But I feel that personally I've kind of taken his skills for granted a little bit, just because of his ubiquity over the years in Formula E. I mean, as soon as we lost Stoffel from the main field in Formula E, I felt the loss, and I think it would be the same if Mitch had to step down for any reason. And obviously, I hope he doesn't. And it looks at this stage like for as long as Jaguar's going to be there, Mitch Evans will be there. But what's interesting for me is that he's always, since he joined Formula E, wholly committed to Formula E. I looked at his Wikipedia page. He had a single race for SMP Racing, or Simp Racing, as I like to call them, in LMP2 before he came to Formula E. But after that, it's just been Formula E all the way. And I remember in a press conference, he was next to Jev, I think, and Jev was talking about, at the time, he was doing LMP2, I think, for racing for Holland, possibly. And Mitch said, I don't think I need to do that. I already earn enough. It was an interesting viewpoint, because I think a lot of drivers, they think, well, we're not F1 drivers. We have a short career. Let's just do as much as we can before burning out, And I think Mitch is taking a much more sort of savvy, long-term viewpoint on it. Like, he enjoys Formula E, so that's what he's going to stick with.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right when you say that Mitch Evans is a bit of a yardstick. I'm a huge Nick Cassidy fan. I've made that very clear. And recently I made the connection that me and Nick Cassidy actually run the same racing number. I'd never realized that. A lot of people would probably think that was by design. We just both run the 37. I don't know.
It's fate.
Yeah, it must be. It must be, But what I will say is the main rival to Nick Cassidy's title of the GOAT it's Mitch Evans. It's not Jean-Eric Verne, it's not Buemi, it's not Verlaine, it's none of those other champions. And I would argue that, fair enough, maybe there's 8 champions on the grid this season, but I would say there's 8 asterisk. Mitch Evans is the best driver in Formula E. Statistically, in terms of how many wins he has, nobody's won any more races than him as of this race. Actually, he took the record this race, and he's only the 4th driver in Formula E history to surpass 1,000 points. He's an all-timer, whether he has a championship to his name yet or not. He has won more races than there are in an entire season. Guy's a champion. He just hasn't won the title yet. Every single year, I think, going into it, this could be Mitch Evans' year. And I never stop thinking that until the final race in the season when somebody else has won it. He's always there. And he showed why in this race. What an unbelievable move for the race lead. And to be honest, one of many absolutely fantastic moves that we saw throughout that race. I would say turned into a little bit of a classic, to be honest.
And Jaguar lost James Barclay, their CEO, to I think the McLaren LMDH team that's coming along next season. But I think having with Ian James having slotted into that team and now looking like he's been there all the time, they clearly haven't lost any of their amazing strategists, because that sort of cycling style strategy where Evans and Da Costa chopped through the field together. It just worked perfectly, didn't it, for both of them? Well, at least for both of them until Da Costa got rear-ended by Drugovich anyway, which we'll talk about later.
Yeah, it was a bit of a skill issue from Drugovich, to use your terminology from the notes.
But like the way that they carve through the field together, the way that they work together, I've always felt that teams involving Da Costa, you've got to bear in mind that Da Costa wants to be the top dog, but he seems to have worked out that he needs to be more political. He needs to be more savvy these days, and I think he was willing to help Mitch. And what's more, I think Mitch just ultimately had more pace than anyone else. And the thing I wanted to get to is he's always had that pace. And when you look at his earlier racing record, it does look like Formula E is the place where he's really peaked because, GP2, he wasn't always in the best car, the best team, but then he made it to Formula E, and like you say, he's always been a top six driver. Quite often, he's been in the winner's circle. And I just wanted to look a bit at what's given him such longevity. What's made him a driver for so many seasons? What do you think?
I think it probably goes back to what you say about him being committed to it. When you're a driver, like even take Nick Cassidy. He was driving the Daytona 24 hours last week, the week before, whenever it was. So I can't imagine he felt particularly fresh going into this. I know whenever I've taken part in a 24 hours in the simulator, I feel dead for a week afterwards. So I can't possibly imagine what driving an LMP2 in real life feels like for the best part of 8 hours, all through the night, etc. But more than that, it reduces your time in the simulator for Formula E or for any of your proper preparations for Formula E as well. So, to be honest, I think it probably is that Mitch is the guy that very early in his career he said, I'm going to be the greatest of all time in Formula E. And honestly, despite not having a championship to his name, I don't think you can count him out of that discussion. I think it would be a fool's errand to put him anywhere lower than second on tiers of the greatest Formula E drivers in history.
Yeah. And by the way, fact check of myself, of course, Jev never drove for Racing for Holland. Why would he? He drove for G-Drive in LMP2. Never mind. But coming back to the race, other than that Evans masterclass in carving through the field, I think we saw generally a Jaguar improvement, but we also saw, this was the first decent race for Felipe Drugovich as well. Now, obviously his race ended with him rear-ending Antonio Felix da Costa at the hairpin, having already got the braking wrong a couple of laps before that as well. But I think Drugovich can take a lot out of this, particularly as Jake Dennis struggled so much, to excuse the pun.
Yeah, I think these cars are notoriously hard under braking, specifically, especially as a rookie. They're completely different to anything else you've ever driven. I spent a little bit of time over the last week driving the Gen 3 Evo in the simulator in our Factor 2. I couldn't get the Miami Grand Prix layout, so I had to use the, I believe it's called the Circuit d'Azur in our Factor 2, the Monte Carlo layout, which, as I've said, I can't wait to go to. So that wasn't any particular chore for me. What was a chore was braking in these cars, because there's a very specific methodology to doing it. You have to lift off to allow the regen to kick in, and then you have to kick your frictional brakes in. The majority of the slowing down is done in this lift and coast manner. So it's, if you're racing and you're trying to push the boundaries of finding the limit, ultimately, what you're going to do is you're going to lift and coast less and brake later. As instinctually as a racing driver, that's what you do. That doesn't really work in these cars. You don't slow down as efficiently, and more than that, you use more energy as a result of it, and you kind of put yourself at a deficit for another fight later. So you just have to drive the cars slightly less aggressively, if that makes sense on the regeneration. Yeah. But I can't really hold one big incident like that against Drugovich too much, because it was a really good race for him. And when it came down to it, he was trying to keep his car as close as possible to the car ahead of him, which that's Formula E, as we established in the last podcast. That's just how they race. They're right on each other's tails more than any other series. And he was trying to do that. He was doing ultimately what he thought was the right thing to do, which was lift off later, brake later, extract more grip from the tires. But the tires weren't there for him. And that has to be my biggest critique of Formula E, is those Hankook tyres have got to go. And I'm so glad they are going next season.
Yeah, I remember when they introduced the Hankooks for the Gen 3 cars, and I remember thinking, well, I put £17 Hankook tyres on my Fiesta. That was my first car, and they were about as good as the Formula E tyre, honestly. In fact, if memory serves me correctly, about 3 months later, I did actually spin off the road. I don't think that was the fault of the tyres, I've got to say, before anyone sues me. Yeah, those all-weather tyres, I think they came from a previous idea of what Formula E should be, because it was about showing roadworthiness, it was about showing sustainability. I think I'm glad they're moving to a different formula of tyre, because when Gen 4 comes in, I think it becomes more of a pure racing formula. I think it becomes less about can we show environmental friendliness and sustainability, which are obviously both very important things, with it being an all-electric series, and let's just show the ultimate performance, because the farce of, well, I mean, let's not call it a farce. Going behind the safety car was a safety measure, which race control thought that they needed. But then they went to a standing start anyway, so it kind of negated the safety car start in the first place. I know you've written in the notes that you want to really express your displeasure at the way that was carried out.
Yeah, it wasn't a good look all around. And it was interesting to see the commentators try and fight that battle, because as soon as they went out on the safety car, I think it was Karun Chandok that said, well, I don't know what they're going to do now, because it wouldn't be very good to have a rolling start behind the safety car. But also, they're getting heat into their tyres now, and if they take a standing start, they'll lose all heat in the tyres again. But then, a couple minutes later, he went back on it and said that it was a fantastic decision from race control to have that standing start after taking the safety car out. So I'm not usually the kind of person to accuse anybody of being an industry shill, but he did sound a little bit like one in that moment. And I had in my own personal notes at one point that he sounded a bit like a wet blanket during the racings. I'll have to, when we get to more over to that end, I'll try and dig that note out as well. But I think, it wasn't a very good look. What was a good look was all of the burnouts on the grid. That was very enjoyable, and probably the most use that the Hankooks got all night. But I imagine it smelled fantastic on the grid for all the spectators to get all of that burning rubber. Especially Dan Tickton was probably loving it after getting that penalty for a burnout in the pit lane in race 1, I think it was. But being able to do a proper one on the grid probably felt a little bit, what's the word? I don't know.
Felt like cathartic?
Catharsis, that's exactly what I'm looking for. It probably felt cathartic for him.
And let's face it, letting Dan Tickton let out his emotions is what Formula E appears to be all about these days.
That's certainly what it's about for him. He came in for tyres, which is not something you have to do in Formula E, but it's something you're allowed to do. And that's a caveat that does have to be mentioned, because in most series, when you say, oh, and they came in for tyres, that's an expected thing. In Formula E, you don't have to do that. The only time you would really do that is if you feel like you've got it wrong with your tyre pressures and you're trying to put a different set of tyres on with different pressures to try and combat that. If you're maybe gambling on a safety car, which I think they were, but you could hear the despondence again in the car. He didn't want to do it. He doesn't want to be there. Honestly, if this season keeps going this way, I don't know if he'll be here next year. I wouldn't keep punishing myself if I was in his shoes.
So, two comments stuck out for me. One after the last race weekend, and one before this one. Dre Harrison of Motorsport 101 said on Blue Sky, paraphrasing, but he said it's kind of astonishing how Formula E thinks it can turn Dan Tickton into an amazing redemption story when he writes things like he does on that Instagram caption, and we'll come to that later. But also, Zach Evans on our server said, "Thank you for this, Zach. It's like listening to a one-man Derek and Clive." Now, for those of you not old enough to know, Derek and Clive was Peter Cook and Dudley Moore doing a drunk, spontaneous recording and then putting it on record. And yeah, it's the same Essex wine as Peter Cook, only not quite as funny. But anyway, but we'll come back to Tickton later. He was kind of a non-entity as far as the racing went this time, and I don't think he deserves that much space in the race roundup. But I do want to talk about tangential issues with him. But yeah, I was impressed with Drogovic, and one thing I would say about him is that there was some doubt when he won Formula 2 as to whether his driving style would actually suit Formula E. People felt that his style was a bit too tough on the tyres for Formula E, and that was what did well for him in F2 eventually. But it's turned out to not be the case, or at least he's turned out to be able to adapt. And obviously, this was a wet race. There were more variables, and that was why the Stellantis cars were hanging around the midfield and the back. Not a great race for Cassidy, I've got to say. And how much of that was down to his awful new shaved head look?
Probably not much, because as we all know, weight is very important in race cars, and every gram saved is a whole second on the track. So, I'm assuming he gained quite a lot from shedding his locks. But yeah, no, not a great race from Citroën. And I think it goes back again to tire pressures. It looked like they had gambled on different tire pressures to the majority of the grid. Then they just got caught in the back, where the breakaway group really shot away and took control of the race. Cassidy did what he's usually fantastic at, and did a fantastic job at again of conserving energy. When he came over the line, he was still having a bit more energy than towards the end of the race, he still had double the energy that the front runners had, but maybe to his detriment at this point. It was maybe too much conservation and not enough aggression. He didn't take his attack modes until right at the end either, whereas was Drugovich that took attack mode really early, wasn't it?
First lap, yeah.
First lap, yeah, and that was such a fantastic little bit of strategy there. It allowed him to command the race right at the beginning, and he was there all the way until his unfortunate incident where, unfortunately, his driving style resulted in the tyres letting him down, which as was a popular critique of him going in. But again, I tend to blame the Hankook tyres more than the driver. They're bad. They're really, really bad. And as someone that puts Bridgestone on my car, no, not sponsored, I promise. I'm really happy to see them go to Bridgestone. I'm more happy to see them have multiple tire compounds, because they are still sticking with an all-weather baseline, but they're moving to a typhoon tire, I think they've called it, for extreme wet conditions. And I think that's sort of the right idea for Formula E. I think we talk about them not necessarily, or rather, we talk about them in the beginning it being more applicable to road spec cars, but I think what they should be doing at the moment is really doubling down on the sustainability of things, and sustainable rubber is a thing. Let's produce racing slicks for these cars and also contribute to sustainable rubber. We don't have to do it like Ford did over 100 years ago, where all of the trees died anyway. There's so much better science nowadays. I'm absolutely certain a company that's involved in the United States military industrial complex, that's ABB, by the way, I'm sure they can manage to grow some rubber trees.
Yeah, I joking on Discord about the way that Abt, who have now left Formula E after Lola broke their partnership with them, seem to have turned their name into an initialism, even though Hans-Jürgen Abt was the founder. I wondered if ABB was maybe originally a single name and was founded by a guy called Hans-Jürgen Ab, but apparently not. But coming back, one other person who didn't have a great race, and in fact it started all the way in free practice, he just couldn't seem to find a setup. Oliver Rowland was nowhere, and Nissan had a good race with Norman, or at least a good qualifying with Norman Nato, but Rowland just didn't get it together this weekend. And I know Formula E sometimes brings these weekends where very good drivers, former champions in Rowland's case, don't get it together, but it was surprising this time, especially since those variable conditions have suited him in the past.
I think these conditions really were quite difficult. They were inclement, but it wasn't too wet, it wasn't too dry. And we saw that multiple times with cars taking different lines. They were searching for grip and traction throughout the track. Different cars were taking different lines. This is another thing I think I noticed Karun say during the race was, it's a one-line corner through there. But as he was saying that, there were cars taking two very different lines through the corner. Yeah, Roland and NATO, it was not necessarily a good race for them. Pretty anonymous, to be honest. But the same could be said with a lot of the drivers at the back of the grid. A lot of champions, to be said, had completely anonymous races. Jake Dennis, Jean-Eric Verne pulled off an absolutely incredible triple overtake, but other than that, was completely anonymous. One thing I will say for Nato was that when I say Nick Cassidy did a fantastic job of conserving energy, Nato had another 50% of the energy that Cassidy had, and Cassidy had double the energy of everybody else in the field. So that says how much that NATO conserved. But again, he finished, was it sort of 17th or something like that?
I think so, yeah.
And it's just needless. I think there was a lot of teams just gambled with, from what it looks like on the outside anyway, a lot of teams seem to have gambled on tire pressures and not have came back to them in any way, shape or form. And I think when we look at the likes of Jaguar doing so well, a long-standing powerhouse of the sport, and then you look at Citroen. Yes, fair enough, Maserati, a new team arguably, inexperienced, bad call on the tire strategy, and it ultimately came to bite them. And I think you could probably say the same with every other team that took the reduced tire pressures. It just didn't pan out for them, all the way down the grid.
And one place where you're very unlikely to get any kind of rain before race day is the Jeddah Corniche circuit, which is the next stop for Formula E. Now, I have in the past, I think the last season I did Formula E seriously, not covered Saudi Arabian races for reasons which I've published before. And I wasn't going to use this conversation as a way of building a permission structure or making myself feel better if I did, because, I think people should stand by their own convictions on stuff. I'm on the fence. I kind of feel like I'm getting into a rhythm covering Formula E again, and I think that this podcast is not a stick to sports podcast. I mean, I think any stick to sports listeners will be on the race by now instead, or will be on Andrew Frankel's The Intercooler or something rather than here. I think if you're here, you kind of accept that I'm going to ramble on about politics occasionally. And that's part of the price of listening to me. But I do wonder with Jeddah whether it's worth taking a stand and not covering it, or whether for a small creator it's just cutting off your nose to spite your face. I wondered the same thing with Miami, honestly. After I started watching it, I thought, my God, we are in the worst part of America here. We're in the reddest of red states. We're in Donald Trump's current home state. And it's currently America is a terrible place to be a trans person as well. And I did think, well, if I'm going to boycott Saudi Arabia, maybe I need to boycott America. Maybe I need to not cover the London E-Prix as well, given how Keir Starmer's treating trans people. I'm not going to say it's a slippery slope, because if you've got politics that you want to stick to, then stick to it. But you gave me an alternative view when we were talking about this before, which was, well, maybe it's not down to creators to stop covering stuff and let people whitewash. Maybe it's down to us to actually talk about it instead.
Well, I think effectively what we're doing here is we're making a Formula E podcast. We said in the first episode that this wasn't necessarily intended to be exclusively about Formula E. And I know you've got ideas for things to cover that aren't Formula E, but ostensibly at the moment, we're covering Formula E. And it just doesn't make sense for us to remove the opportunity to cover a race around, put out a podcast, produce the product, however you want to call it, the thing that we're making at the expense of nothing. Because realistically, what is it going to do if we don't cover the Jeddah E-Prix? Ben Slyam's not going to look, God, my favorite podcast, it's not running this month. We can't possibly go back. It's not going to happen. It's not realistic. What we can do is be constructive with the time that we have and the platform that we have. We have an audience that, as you say, are likely politically tuned in by virtue of even being here. People like to take a pot shot at the race every now and again, and I will say it was pretty interesting of them to say that there was too much white on a Ferrari after one of the most iconic Ferraris of all time having quite a lot of white on it. To be honest, that's sort of where my experiences with the race lies, but I think you're probably right in terms of that they have a much larger following that will just like to stick to the racing. They'll obviously have some following that will be engaged in the politics, and it'll go both ways. But for us, we don't really gain anything by not covering it. We lose a lot potentially by not covering it, and we could do more good with the time to cover it than to not cover it. Because right now we're having a discussion about how problematic it is that we're even thinking about covering the Saudi Arabian race. That's discourse, that's discussion, that's ultimately putting it out to our audience to highlight the issues with it. We're not then effectively just closing the shutters and saying, "Oh, we're just not open this week."
Yeah, and I think there is a conversation to be had about how close Formula E is getting to the Saudi regime, and whether having a golden handcuffs deal with the Public Investment Fund, for example, is a good use of the FIA's all-electric series. I feel that it's papering over a lot of cracks in Saudi Arabia. For example, the way that they've displaced tribes where NEOM is now, the way that that's an environmental disaster, whether it gets built or not. And also, quite how successful their opening up of driving to women has actually been, whether it's just the very upper classes and the very privileged that are getting that chance. But I think that's a conversation we can have, and my hope is that I can go away and do my own research and sound knowledgeable when I do it. But also talk about some good racing, hopefully, as well.
I mean, ultimately, the goal is for all of these things to succeed in an equitable fashion. I would love for all of it can't happen, but if there was a way for NEOM to be built without the tribes being displaced, and a woman could drive from one end of it to the other, that would be the Saudi paradise that they're claiming it would be. Ultimately, that's not the reality, and we have a platform to highlight that, and I think that's the important thing to do. As you say, that this isn't just the sports and nothing else podcast. I don't think it's ever really been that.
Yeah. And, at one point in 2019, I did get accreditation to Saudi Arabia, but, there's reasons why that wouldn't happen again.
Oh?
Anyway, what were you going to say, sorry?
Really?
Anyway, yeah, so another item I wanted to talk about was something I'm quite excited about, which is Opel coming in to form another exclusively new team for Formula E. Now, a lot of the time when we see new teams coming in, they're taking over an existing franchise, and that was honestly what I assumed would happen with Opel, because there was talk of them becoming Opel Penske and just taking over the DS license, which would have suited, because there are far more Opels in the world than DS is. DS is not the most successful Stellantis brand out of many unsuccessful Stellantis brands. And I just thought it made sense from all fronts. But Jay Penske and the Penske Media Group, rather, has not been a fun place to be for manufacturers over the years. Porsche almost signed a deal with Dragon Racing before they came in themselves, and it just seems like they never seem to get any stickiness from manufacturers, because it looks as though they're going to lose the Works Stellantis license next season. I guess it's a question, therefore, in what shape Jay Penske's team continues in, but it's exciting, Opel coming in. And the other reason I think it's exciting is because, do you remember there was all that talk about how Americans thought Colin McRae wasn't real because they'd seen Colin McRae rally and they thought he was a made-up character, yeah? So I did the same thing with Tim Tramnitz. So Tim Tramnitz was the teammate of Arava in the fictional F1 game universe that Arava set up. I thought he was a made-up driver. I didn't realise he was a Formula 3 driver progressed several years in the future. Turns out, yeah, he's a Formula 3 hot shoe, and Opel would like him very much to join their team, if you believe Sam Smith in the race, which I kind of do. It's exciting. I'd like to see Opel coming in. What are your thoughts?
I think it's really exciting. Like you say, we've already established that it's a fool's errand to compare Formula E to Formula 1, but I think this is a bit more of a fair comparison when we see the likes of Audi take over Sauber. That's kind of a correlate to how Citroën took over Maserati. But what we're seeing now is Cadillac enter. Opel. And I think it's really good to see, as I said, with regards to Citroën, it's good to see new manufacturers investing in the sport, and especially when it comes to building a full works team, investing long term in the sport. Are they joining next season? It is.
Looks like it, yeah.
So this is a team that will join with the Gen 4 car, and from then on, they're only going to see the car develop. They're only going to see the series develop. And I think they're getting in at a really good time. As I say, with the cars developing and the tracks developing, we've already shaken off the early dust of not even being able to run the full Monaco layout. Now the Monaco E-Prix is probably the best race that's held at Monaco all year. Maybe with the exception of the vintage Grand Prix. That's pretty fantastic every year as well. But as well as that, the cars are just monstrous nowadays.
Mm.
The technological know-how and the manufacturing processes that go into producing them, it is a lot more akin to Formula One now than it was when you were just buying an SRT 01E off the shelf from Spark in season one. And I don't have they specified what their powertrain's going to be? Are they building their own? Are they going to be taking one from Stellantis like everybody else? Or
Well, I mean, Opel is Stellantis, so
yeah,
I
exactly.
imagine they'll take it from them.
Yeah. So it'll basically just come down to building the chassis for them, I would imagine. And I think the Gen 4 probably is the most complicated chassis we've had so far in terms of A, putting it together, and B, all of the components that go into it. So there'll be a long learning process for them with regards to setting up their facilities, how they even draw data from the car, what data is useful, how do they use it, all of these things that that Cadillac are going through right now in Formula One. As they say after the first test in Formula One, they're fundamentally changing their approach to things. We might as well see things like that with Opel. They may come in with one philosophy, find out that it's completely wrong, and have to change tack to something else. This is all part of the excitement of a genuinely new team joining the sport.
So let's play fantasy Formula E. I did have a slot for, when we weren't covering races, called the Dream Draft, where I got people to do this for real. But like, if you had Tramnitz in an Opel team, who would be his teammate? Would you go for experience, or would you go for a double rookie team? Like Fisichella Schumacher 97 or something.
You already know my answer. It's Nick. It's either Nick or Mitch.
So you would jump Nick from Citroen to Opel. Interesting.
If the goal of this fantasy is to produce the best team, yes, I drag Nick out of contract, or I get Mitch. It's one of those two. Statistically, let's be honest, look at Jaguar last season. That was a super team. Statistically, they should have won every race, but they didn't. But they had the best shot of it because they had the two winningest drivers in the sport. You can't go wrong. I don't think, especially when it comes to electric racing, I don't think we can do the true fantasy thing of, I'll have 1999 Schumacher in the car. We can't do that because he didn't drive in Formula E. You can say, I'll have 2014, that one race Jean-Eric Verne drove. Yeah, but I don't know.
Oh no, I meant in terms of like how for 97 Jordan brought in Fisichella and Ralf Schumacher, neither of whom had almost any experience. And
okay.
At the time, I thought that would be a disaster, but it turned out to be okay. So yeah.
Alternatively, Drugovich.
Yeah, sure. Why not? I mean, people do tend to stay in Formula E and just move around the teams when they've shown some success. It's interesting, though, yeah. The other thing Opel could do, and the other thing I've been crying out for teams to do, because every year we have a women's test, every year it's very successful, and every year the women don't get a race drive. I keep thinking when a driver's got to take a break for whatever reason, sports cars, injury, they're going to bring in one of the women from the women's test. They never do. Poor old Chloe Chambers turns up there every year, does a fantastic job, and goes away knowing she's probably not going to get picked. I would give someone like Chloe Chambers a go. I know she's not going to be among the quickest probably on the grid, but that's not the point. It's showing that she isn't going to be the slowest, and also showing that if she is the slowest, you're going to give her time to develop. I think, unfortunately, there is a view that if you pick a woman, she's got to be fantastic instantly, because otherwise no one's going to pick any other woman again in the future. But I think the talent is now out there. I think the development's out there with F1 Academy. I think F1 Academy for me is a bit like The Voice on ITV. After you win it, where do you go? Hopefully, with Dorian Pan actually becoming a Mercedes sim driver this year, that will be the start of something. But I'm hopeful that if Formula E ever put its money where its mouth was with the test and gave a woman a race drive, she would actually do a decent job.
What I will say is, the thing that's excited me more than that is Abbi Pulling, specifically being ran for Nissan in the rookie free practice for Miami. I think Abbi Pulling probably has the best shot at actually getting a race seat in Formula E, but I don't really know if that's where she's targeted her career at the moment. She's racing in GB3. This will be her second season in GB3. She's obviously part of Nissan's Formula E effort, but I think her GB3 duties keep her pretty much locked into that and doesn't really give her much opportunity to engage with Formula E outside of these rookie free practice tests. But I think she would be my first candidate. I know you say Chloe Chambers, but I'd be looking no further than Abbi Pulling. And I
Yeah.
think she'd do a fantastic job in it as well.
Yeah, I think Chloe Chambers sprang to mind because Elizabeth Blackstock years ago said you should look out for her. She's brilliant, and so I've always sort of put a pin in what she's doing every season. But yeah, Abbi Pulling obviously romped the F1 Academy Championship a year ago, and has done decently in GB3. I think it's a step up. She will improve this season, and I'm just really glad that she's with a big team like Rodin that can actually support her.
Yeah, it is. It's nice to see, as you say, there is sort of a bit of an onus on any woman driver that gets this far in motorsport to be fantastic straight out of the gates. But ultimately, you kind of are limited by your machinery, by the people you have around you as well. And to see a team with the caliber and the history of Roden throw their full weight behind her, it's been fantastic to see. I don't know if we've really seen an industry effort behind one specific driver like that since the likes of Susie Wolf. I'm trying to think. Dave Alota, God rest her soul. She was part of the Manor Academy, but I don't know if the Manor Academy had quite the same efficacy, shall we say,
Yeah.
as what Susie Wolf went through, or at least what Abbi Pulling is now going through with her connection to the Formula E Academy with Nissan. Nissan is a big company, they're well respected. Arguably the Formula E team's not doing particularly great this season so far, but she's in the conversation, and I think that's the important thing. As you say, having these women in the conversation is important, but what's more important is the opportunities actually manifesting for them. And this, I think, is an example of an opportunity actually manifesting for one. That was to say, be alongside Gabriele Mini getting the rookie free practice test at Miami.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just think that for a niche form of motorsport like Formula E, I've argued this whenever your Joel Ericssons or your Tom Dillmans or your Tom Blomqvists come in, sure they're probably going to give you 13th in free practice and a steady development through the weekend, but wouldn't you much rather have a bit of marketing buzz from someone brand new and someone who's going to bring potentially a completely new audience and sponsorship base to the sport? I also think Formula E is not Formula One. It's never been traditionally male dominated, and it's never had to worry about being macho. I think that's because it's not stereotypically bloke coded. It's not Clarkson coded. I think Formula E would be the place where a woman could excel.
Well, I want to make a pretty obvious caveat there that the grid absolutely is male dominated. In the first season, was it Catherine Legg was on the grid, and
Simona de Silvestro was there
as well. Neither of them finished the whole season.
Michela Durruti as well. Sorry.
Okay, yeah. I knew there was at least more than one, but Catherine Legg is the name that I always remember. Big up to the goat there. But I don't know. For me, I think there's a lot of, with any motorsport, I know we tend to segment Formula E off by virtue of being electric, but at the end of the day, it is a motorsport. And one of the most important things in motorsport is brand heritage, respect that you gain just by virtue of being associated with these brands. And as I said a minute ago, Nissan is a huge brand. They're a very prestigious brand, and they're a brand that's been around for a very long time. They run in motorsports out with Formula E. They've had GT3 programs. They have had entries in Australian supercars. They've had LMP1s, famously a front-wheel drive LMP1 that didn't go very well, but they tried. That was the important thing. I think it's sort of like Ferrari in Formula One, right? They're not winning right now, but if you get a Ferrari contract, you're set for life. You would think, as long as you don't mess it up in a sort of Eurivip style way. Not that was a Ferrari, not that was anything Ferrari related. I think you know what I'm getting at there. And any opportunity to name an Estonian racing driver.
Well, yeah. Paul Aaron. Let's hope he gets another chance.
Yes, Paul Aaron.
Yeah, I actually, Eurivips came up the other week. So I was talking to your colleague from Prismatic Motorsports, Jess, and I said, Yuri Vips would have been the first Estonian in Formula One if only he hadn't done a racism. And of course, Jess correctly responded, but he did do a racism, didn't he, Sasha?
But he did do a racism, and unfortunately for him, we live in a day and age where actually people care now, and I think that's a good thing, because he would have been racing, even just as superficially as he would have been racing alongside Lewis Hamilton, and you don't know what latent thoughts and feelings he has about that. But more than anything, I think this is a bit of a personal tangent, I will say here, but I think it's really disappointing that Lewis Hamilton sort of seems as if he's going to drop off the grid in the next few years. And it doesn't seem like there will be... We're going to go back to basically being all white guys, is the take-home message here. And Formula E is really not that far away from that.
Yeah, and also when you look at the kind of white guys that there are in Formula E in terms of the drivers, with the exception of a few who are quite politically switched on, Degrassi not in the way I would like, but he is politically switched on, and there are others who've said things which are enlightened or at least show a lot of reading, but then you look and a lot of it's becoming cookie cutter, and maybe this will continue to be the case as manufacturers are building up their academies and as manufacturers continue to dominate Formula E, but hopefully not. Brings me on to a topic that we ought to cover, because we cut it from the last podcast because it just seemed more trouble than it was worth. So essentially, I was going to talk about Dan Ticktum's rant in Mexico. I realised after you sent me his famous Instagram caption about driving a Ford GT while people eat chicken Kyivs in their mother's basement, that
about
actually
your laptop as well.
Yeah, exactly. By the way, my HP potato is packed in my bag, ready to go, ready to travel tomorrow. But so I realised at that point that this was not the good bloke redemption story that I maybe was willing it to be. And I wonder if maybe it's worth Formula E giving quite so much of a platform to someone who still hasn't scored a point in the series this season. Clearly, Jeff Dodds was very happy to host him, the CEO of Formula E, last week in London. And, fair play to Dan. He apparently drove himself there, presumably in the Ford GT, let's hope. And, having a meeting with Jeff Dodds is not necessarily something that you do without having a very good reason to do so, I would say. In fact, I actually commented on the Discord. I wonder if that's on the FIA list of punishments now. But regardless, he went and talked to Jeff Dodds about driving standards. Jeff apparently spoke to him and said, by all means criticise, but could you do it in private first? Which I'm not sure that's the point of criticism, but still. But the thing that I thought happened upon, which I hadn't thought about at all. Obviously, there is a pipeline in politics of people going from the left to the right because there's more money on the right. And you just questioned, are we looking at Dan Ticktum using his persona, not necessarily as a right-wing grift, I'm not suggesting that, but as a way to mark himself out in the culture war as an anti-woke figure when everybody else is so cookie-cutter and bland and nice. A kind of Clarkson in a world of Lando Norrises, effectively. Do you suspect that? Do you think this is a Ticktum pipeline?
See, what I would say is I don't necessarily know if it's intentional, but the way that he speaks on the radio, some of the things that he says about his fellow competitors, he is setting himself apart from them. The way that he spoke the last round about them all being, and I will still quote him directly, even though he misspoke, impetulant children. The way that he is constantly on the radio saying, "Oh, I don't want to do this. Why are you making me do this?" He's setting himself up as sort of like the school of hard knocks, salt of the earth guy that just wants to get his race done, but keeps getting affected by all of these things. And what I would say is something that gets said to a lot of sim racers very early in their careers. You just have to figure it out, bro. When you're involved in incident after incident after incident, you have to look at yourself as the common denominator and start trying to unpack why. There's something fundamental to, and I mean, 3 times when we're in school, we do experiments in science, in chemistry, say, and we test these things 3 times and we say, okay, that's enough. And if you get the same answer 3 times, usually you're pretty happy to say that that's the answer. First 3 races of the season, no points, very bad races, very bad finishes, ruined. his season's gone. And every single time he's been the first person to announce it to the world, and much to his own dismay as well. The mentality I think he has is sort of fundamentally different to the majority of the drivers there. And I think he knows that. And I think everybody knows that. Whether it comes to wheel racing with him, like, that's not what I mean. I mean, just how he acts interpersonally while he's racing. You don't hear other drivers on the radio speaking quite like him. I mean, sure, every now and again you'll hear somebody call somebody an idiot because they've made a move that was maybe a little bit ambitious and they made a little bit of contact. But that's racing. That's always been the way. That's kind of what the engineers on the other side of the radio ought to be, a pastoral role as well as an engineering role. You're to keep the driver's head in the right operating window, much like the machinery. And I question how small Dan Ticktum's mental operating window is at this point, to be honest. It just seems like he's always, to use a term from gaming, he's always so tilted that he just doesn't even want to be there. And I don't know how long they're going to let him stay there if that's how he keeps acting.
Well, there's a chat that I did many years ago. It's still on this feed with the actually trans motorsport journalist Ida Wood from Formula Scout, and she talked about how Ticktum is a complex figure who people feel they need to whisper to get the best out of. You know, he invites sympathy from the engineers because they can see the talent is there. But I think equally, I think she also pointed to the number of times that Ticktum has got in trouble as a determining factor in his career, and of course, you know, Kiro and Russell O'Hagan have stuck by him because, again, he's won a race for them. He's done incredibly well. But I think O'Hagan's comments after the last race were interesting. He's clearly also trying to tread a fine line and trying not to defend everything.
I likened one driver to a driver from Formula One on the last podcast. I can't remember who it was I likened to Kamui Kobayashi, but I likened someone to Kamui Kobayashi. It was Edo Mortara. It was Edo Mortara. Yeah. I'm going to do a similar thing here where I'm going to say Paul di Resta.
Now, Paul di Resta got a reputation for being difficult that seemed to basically come from a few things a few journalists have been briefed from Force India. And I still don't know whether it was something to do with him taking on Anthony Hamilton as a manager and people not liking Anthony Hamilton. There was weird stuff going on there. But yeah, he had a reputation, you're right.
And ultimately, it killed his career. In Formula One, at least. Nobody wanted to work with him because of how openly and vocally outspoken he was about Force India while he was driving for them over the radio. And that's just like, when you're paying these people millions and millions and you're at the pinnacle of, or what you believe to be the pinnacle of motorsports, it's not, the old adage of all publicity is good publicity does not ring true. It's sort of still the case, win on Sunday, sell on Monday. But more than anything, it's the case, have someone post something bad about you on Sunday, you're not selling on Monday. And I think drivers along the lines of Dan Ticktum, along the lines of Paul di Resta, just seem to be lowering the stock of their team in the eyes of who it matters with. Because I'm pretty sure Karoo are not one of the most financially well-doing teams on the grid, as it were. And by the same token, Force India weren't in particularly good nick at the time either. So I think while maybe he thinks there's a place for his attitude in the sport, I don't know if the sport thinks there's a place for his attitude in it.
Well, it'll be interesting to follow. I want to close with a bit of fun because last night we were going to be recording this podcast and an EV-related adventure happened for you, which we're not allowed to talk about, and I'm not going to ask you about. But I am going to ask you about your mountain trip with your new EV, because you've got a Peugeot E308 in, I believe, gold or yellow.
208.
And
it's a 208.
Sorry. And it's my favourite looking EV for sure. But tell me about your trip to the Scottish mountains. Like, how harrowing was that in your range anxious EV?
The crux of what we can't talk about is I just hadn't charged it enough. But no, to get back to my trip to, when I say mountains, it was really more hills. I'm aware that there is a very specific delineation between a mountain and a hill. It's something like 2,100 feet or something like that. I don't don't know. We were playing trivia games while we were out there, and that was one of the questions. What is the exact delineation between a hill and a mountain? So I think I did say mountains to you when I said what I was doing, but I think more accurately it would be termed hills. Honestly, I was very pleasantly surprised by how the car handled it. Generally, I drive to work every day. Well, when I'm at work, obviously not every single day. But when I drive to work in my car each day, it takes me anywhere between, from my 50 kilowatt battery, it takes about 12 to 17%, depending on how cold it is to get to work. And that's about 20 miles away. So I'll use about, for sake of argument, between 25 and 32 to get there and back. It's 40 minutes of driving. So I thought to myself, an hour, it's going to be maybe about 50%. Regardless of the distance, I thought I'll just plan for that hour of power usage. And it actually turned out to be my most efficient journey of all time in the car. Generally on the motorway, and I know motorway driving will particularly sap the power from an electric car, but generally I tend to average around 2.5, 2.4 kilowatts miles per kilowatt rather. So out of my 50 kilowatt battery, it can probably get about 120 miles, but that's if you're running it to zero, which you can't. You're realistically never going to run it lower than 10% of the battery. If you get to that point, you really want to be charging it pretty soon. But I ended up hitting 3.1 miles per kilowatt on the way home, at least. On the way there, it was a little bit more power. There was more power consumption because it was raining quite a lot. There was a lot of puddles on the roads, so that affects energy usage as well. But on the way home, and I'm going to sit here and say I'm not the kind of person to speed, but I'm also not really the kind of person to. I know that it's more energy efficient to drive at 57 miles an hour than 60. No, I'm going to drive at 60. That's if I need to charge the car slightly earlier, I need to charge the car slightly earlier. But I was genuinely surprised with how well it handled it. And I ended up charging the car for about 5 hours before we left, which added maybe like 25% to its charge, because it's a 3 kilowatt per hour granny charger I have. Ultimately, I could have got there and back without realistically having to charge the car based on how efficient the journey back was. And as I say, 2 hours of driving on a 50 kilowatt battery, it's reasonably good going at this time of year when it's as cold as it is in Scotland, and through the hills. It was up and down everywhere. There was a lot of inclines. So I was genuinely pleasantly surprised with the car. One thing I will say is when it came to the puddles on the road, the car was more equipped than any other car I've driven before by virtue of how wide its tires are. Electric cars do tend to have slightly wider tires than their ICE counterparts, but it was, if anything, confidence building to drive the car in that situation, not just in terms of my understanding of how its range is used, but also just with the feel of the car itself. Handles itself incredibly well in pretty much every condition that I've had it in.
Well, that's really great to hear. And actually, when I had the Leaf years ago, I remember being very cognizant that although it was a nice toy and, even in a Leaf you could put your foot down and it would really go, it was also something that you could drive economically and you could drive completely differently to anything else that, anything with an engine. And it just made me think, it's a bit like Formula E compared to anything else because, yeah, you can drive a Formula E car like a Formula 2 car, but you probably won't do very well. But if you get the most out of it, then it will get the most out of you. But it's good to know that you don't have to drive it like a total nerd. Like you can still have some fun. You can still accelerate.
No, I will say that the most efficient journeys I've had to work on the motorway and in the small section of road between my house and the motorway and the exit of the motorway in my workplace, the most efficient journeys I've had, the car's been in sport mode every time. If I put it in eco, I might as well not get there because I think the difference is that the eco mode for the car reduces its power output to about 75 horsepower, whereas the normal running mode, I think, doesn't limit it, but there's a little bit of extra press on the pedal, which is, I don't know if you've driven cars with cruise control before, where you have a point where the pedal will stop and then you can press it that little bit more to overcome, whether you're running a speed limiter or something like that. So I think it's inevitably it's a safety feature so that you can overcome a speed limiter in a situation that you absolutely must. But in this car, in my car, when it's in normal driving mode, I think it produces around 95 horsepower. Unless you press that tiny little bit of extra pedal, then you will get all 138. But in sport mode, it uses all 138 all the time, theoretically. So I think it just allows it to carry its momentum slightly better. You need significantly less pedal input to keep the car at speed while you're at motorway speeds when it has that higher amount of power from its powertrain than, say, running the 75, which was more than my last car had anyway. My famously 54 horsepower Skoda Fabia with the 1 litre eco engine that took 14.1 seconds to get to 60 from standing start. But this Peugeot, it does in, I think it's 8 seconds, 8.1. I swear it'll do it quicker though. At 7.9 was what it feels like when you're doing it, when you, from a standing start, put a real pull with the car. It's a fantastic car to drive. Honestly, as someone that had a little bit of range anxiety going into buying my electric car, having done a couple of not long journeys, because I haven't driven it cross country or anything like that, but a couple of longer journeys, the kind of journeys that you would only take a couple of times a year because of the length of them, hasn't been an issue. It's been infinitely cheaper than anything petrol or diesel could even hope to come close to. And in certain situations, I can still charge the car for free. For example, when I'm away, let's just say when I was away in the hills, we're paying for the lodge that we were staying in. You can plug the car in. Don't have to pay for the power. They didn't say if you're going to plug your car in, then we're going to charge you per hour we're going to charge you 26, 27, 28 pence per hour to charge a car. That's just not a discussion. So there are still, I think, very strong benefits to having EVs, as much as the government are trying to disincentivize them by incentivizing them, or whatever it is that they think they're doing at the moment. Surprisingly livable is what I will say.
Okay, well, it's just great to hear someone having fun with electric cars, and that's the reason why I brought this thing back, and I'm really glad that you've been around to share it with us. Georgie, would be great to see you again for it's not for Diriyah, for Jeddah if we are doing
it was
this.
Diriyah.
What a track that was, by the way! But
such a good track.
Be great to have you back for Jeddah if you're interested. Same with all of you. We're on all the podcast platforms. We're also on YouTube now, so feel free to subscribe. It's still a very small channel, but growing, and would love for you to share if you like what we're doing. Equally, if you do want to hear my political and personal ramblings or read them, then I'll give you a link to my newsletter in the description, and there will be videos coming up on a separate channel on that too. But for now, from the Motion Racing Podcast, from myself, Sascha, and from Georgie, it's great to see you all, and see you all soon. Thank you.